When I was 5 years old, my dad came back from a business trip with a film as a present. It was an animation film, so he assumed it was the right thing to give me. The film was dystopian sci-fi classic Akira. I didn't understand a single thing happening in that film. Not one. But it was the coolest thing I have ever watched in my entire life. I was hooked. Normally, in these videos, I analyze the comics I love and what I love about them. But I don't think I need to make the case for Katsuhiro Otomo's magnus opus Akira, or his horror sci-fi masterpiece Domu. His work has that awe-inspiring quality that needs no further explanation. Watching or reading Otomo's stories, especially as a kid, is an overwhelming experience. The dynamism, the intrigue, and the sheer coolness and badassery of it all, it's overwhelmingly good. It's the 16th chapel of 20th century comics. In short, to me, Akira seems like the impossible achievement of a genius. But now that I'm an adult, I understand that there is much more involved in the creation of such a piece of work, much more than just the magic of the muses. So in this video, I wanted to dive deep into the process of making Akira, to know how he came to create such an amazing work of fiction. And after researching, I found that there are 6 steps that led on to him creating this piece of work. And so, in this video, I will take a look at how in these 6 steps, Katsuhiro Otomo, using his own strengths, taste and knowledge, created this masterpiece. So let's start. Step number 1, a boring childhood and a good book. Otomo was born in a small town in the Miyagi prefecture, and during his childhood, manga was his only way of entertainment, as he explains himself.
I am from Tohoku in northern Japan, and it's a very rural area, so I didn't have anything to do during my childhood. So, I read a lot of manga. Back then, my relatives also used to buy me manga. As I have older and younger sisters, I was the only boy in the family. So I used to enjoy reading manga on my own, which would also include drawing my own manga. In that sense, during my childhood, I used to think it would be awesome if I could make manga myself.
A boring childhood seems to be a great start for comic creators. Other great creators inside the medium, such as Chris Ware or Robert Crumb, have remarked how uneventful and boring their childhood was. And in fact, it was boredom itself what pushed them to start drawing their first comics. The funny thing is that this unremarkable rural area of Japan has produced other great manga artists such as Shio Sato, which is one of the leading artists in the shoujo manga scene, and Shotaro Ishimori, father of the Super Sentai genre. I can't say what this area has about it, but maybe the lack of entertainment and stimulation might be a factor. Recent studies in fact suggest that there is a link between boredom and creativity, so being bored is an important part of the process. However, being bored and copying manga was not the only thing that set little Otomo apart. Many other children that love manga have nothing better to do, copy the drawings in the pages. What set Otomo apart was that from a young age he was interested in improving his craft rather than just copying. In several interviews, he quotes getting a book by Shotaro Ishimori called How to Draw Manga as a pivotal moment. After reading the book and understanding the process of making manga better, he started taking it more seriously. Therefore, Otomo, thanks to boredom and the lucky find of a good instructional book, started to study the craft of making manga during elementary school. And few can say that they started that soon. Step number 2. Be a teenager obsessed with popular culture and freedom. During high school, Otomo became a huge cinema fan. In fact, he says that his interest in manga completely shifted to filmmaking. During the late 60s and 70s, American cinema was starting to grow out of the classic Hollywood era system, and new productions with a different energy were starting to become more popular. Otomo took long train rides to watch films in Tokyo and devoured American films, which he often quotes as one of his main influences. One of the films that made a strong impression on young Otomo was 1967 Bonnie and Clyde, which was the first mainstream film to attempt a more realistic portrayal of violence, with the innovative use of squibs, which are small explosive devices attached to actors that mimic the effect of bullets when they hit a person, with the blood and everything. He absorbed a lot of this violent, energetic 70s American cinema and became fascinated by it. It is clear to see in his work how violence and brutality are always an ever-present element in his stories. But it was not only this cinema that influenced his views on violence, but also the student protests that spurred all over the world in the late 60s. Just a year after the release of Bonnie and Clyde in 1968, three major protest movements took place. The May 68 revolution in Paris, the student protests against the American occupation in Tokyo, and the Vietnam War protests in the US. The late 60s and their politically active youth were an enormous influence in the formative years of Otomo. Akira contains the same violent anti-system energy, portraying riots against the military and other government institutions, as well as underground groups of young freedom fighters. So, not only did he take influence from the popular culture surrounding him at the time, but also from the current events and first-hand experiences he had. His passion for visual storytelling crystallized during these years of cinema going and manga reading. But soon he realized that manga was probably his best shot, as he was able to draw already. So he started submitting work to magazines. At 15, in 1969, he got his first piece of work in a magazine. He submitted a 5-page manga to Shonen Sunday magazine, and although the pages didn't get published, they displayed the cover along with a short comment in the magazine. One of the most important first-hand experiences he had in his teen years was moving to Tokyo after graduating high school. Coming from a rural, quiet area, the chaos and energy of urban life made a strong impact on young Otomo. Most of his work takes place in large, chaotic cities that resemble Tokyo, or, in the case of Akira and Domu, they take place in actual Tokyo. In short, during his early formative years, his personal aesthetic and storytelling style grew from a mix of his personal experiences, contemporary American cinema, classic Japanese cinema, and the manga he read throughout his childhood, creating a unique cocktail that was ready to explode once he got his first chance at making his own stories. But this vision still had to meet experience and practice to develop. So this takes us to step number 3. Go pro. After graduating high school at 17 and thanks to a contact that a friend provided, Otomo found work as a manga artist in Tokyo. His first work was in the magazine Weekly Manga Action as an assistant and illustrator. Soon he started working on his own stories, and he had two aims in mind. First, he wanted to pay homage to his favorite mangakas, and secondly, he wanted to make sci-fi stories. In the 70s, sci-fi had stopped being a popular genre for manga. Most mangas at the time were sports mangas or gekigas, which are basically the Japanese term for graphic novels aimed at adults. Otomo wanted to bring back the excitement of the mangas he read as a child. His first job, however, didn't match this vision, and he had to make a name for himself before he was given this opportunity. His first manga, which was never published, was an adaptation of the classic fairy tale The Little Match Girl. This is clearly as far away from exciting sci-fi as you could possibly get. But young Otomo still had to learn a lot before he could be given the chance to tell his own stories. 2 years later, in 1973, after 2 years of working in the industry, he got his first chance to make his own manga with The Gun Report. The published work was a 24-page long manga based on the original story by 19th century French writer Prosper Mérimée. He would continue to get published doing short manga adaptation of European and American authors such as Mark Twain all throughout the following year, honing his craft as a visual storyteller and collaborating with writers inside the manga action magazine he was working for. In 1975, at 21, he finally started writing his own original short stories. He wrote a number of short 20 to 24 page stories depicting characters in the contemporary Tokyo. All of his early work are short stories. And looking at his work, it is clear to see that this is a young artist in the making, learning on the job. These were the years where Otomo put his head down and worked on his craft to be able to make a living and stay in the city. Survival and staying in Tokyo was his main aim. Step number 4. Fail. After changing magazines a couple of times, he landed a job in Young Magazine, a magazine that was aiming to publish work for young rebellious teenagers. In 1979, he started his first ambitious sci-fi series called Fireball. In the late 70s, sci-fi slowly started to become a more popular genre, especially after the success of Star Wars in 1978. Publishers were therefore more open to accepting sci-fi stories, and so opportunity met preparation, and Otomo got the chance to do what he wanted 10 years after his first 5-page manga got a comment on Weekly Shonen Sunday. Being his first attempt, an opportunity to make a more ambitious and longer story, in the excitement and in his ambition, he fell trap to Project Creep. The scope and focus of the story changed to the point where Otomo had to end it abruptly because he basically chewed more than he could swallow. In an interview, he explains how it happened.
The story grew as I was writing it. In fact, after about 20 pages, I just decided that I'd had enough. Originally, it was going to be a much more simpler story about a group of freedom fighters going to destroy the director's evil computer, but en route, it became a tale about psychic superpowers.
It's funny to me that he should mention 20 pages as the point where he grew tired of the story. At that point in his career, 20 pages was about as long as any of his stories had ever been. So maybe he wasn't ready to create a longer story yet, and he did in fact go back to shorter stories after finishing Fireball. However, despite the story coming to an abrupt end, Otomo thinking it was a failure, and the general disappointment of the story being cut short, Fireball has the energy, the charm, and the promise of a young mangaka with a clear vision of the stories he wants to tell. A manga where Otomo is giving it his best shot, but inexperience get the best of it. In his commentary of Fireball, cartoonist Jim Rock summarizes this aspect of Fireball in this way.
One thing I often enjoy in young cartoonists' work is this bursting of ideas. You know, Fireball has that, where it's like, there are a bunch of story threads here, you know, like what's going on with this character, what's the center, you know, there's all these directions that it could take, and a lot of young artists, I'll see that, you know, and I think the idea is like you spend a lot of time getting to this point where you get to write your own story, or you have this publisher that enables you to do it, and there's a sense of, man, if this is the only chance I get, I'm going for it, I'm putting it all in there. And I often enjoy that energy, and Fireball has that energy. You know, as we were just discussing it, there's lots of different places where it's like, you could see more of that, you could see more of this, what happens to this person.
Right.
And, you know, maybe after doing that, you see that refinement. Like, okay, I have a million of these ideas, I'm going to focus on this one that I think's really good. I'm going to hone in on it. So, you know, that's part, I think, of the development of not just a masterpiece, but just a maturing of any kind of storyteller.
For me, on top of being a train wreck that you can't stop watching, Fireball is Otomo's work at the cusp of maturity. His ambition, his vision, and his ability as a visual storyteller are now almost in sync, but not quite there yet. And it is easy to see in hindsight why he wasn't satisfied with it. But to a contemporary reader, this must have been a riveting piece of fiction with some of the most exciting visual in manga at the time. And to the magazine editors, it was a clear proof that Otomo could be trusted with a story of his own. Otomo once summarized his experience with Fireball saying,
"In thinking that Fireball, once written, might not be acceptable, I sought advice and opinions from other manga professionals. The editor of Manga Action told me, I don't care what you do next. So I decided, right, Domu."
His failure in Fireball planted the seeds for the following masterpiece, Domu, and Akira. In hindsight, it could be argued that Fireball was in fact his greatest success. Step number 5. Become self-aware.
The first science fiction manga I wrote was Fireball, and when I was working on this manga, the movie The Exorcist was released. For some reason, this movie really resonated with me, and as a result, I wanted to add a touch of horror to my next manga. In those days, there was also a place called Takashima Daira in the northern part of Tokyo that was notorious for repeated cases of suicide of people jumping from large blocks of flats. That was something I used as a setting for this manga that would have a touch of horror.
1 year after Fireball, Otomo started publishing Domu, a science fiction horror story that tells the story of an epic psychic power war in a run-of-the-mill apartment complex in Tokyo. In Domu, Otomo brought in everything that he was proficient at, and added to it the freshness of his newfound fascination with psychic powers, along with something far more crucial: self-awareness. Otomo must have understood at that point that he had a tendency to expand things beyond his ability to control them. And so, having learned this lesson from Fireball, in this story, Otomo sets some clear boundaries to the scope from the beginning. He confines the story within the limits of the apartment building and embodies the main conflict in two opposing protagonists, a villain and a hero, which he defines clearly from the beginning as such. With this simple act of scope reduction, Otomo preempted the project creep and set himself up for the completion of his first sci-fi masterpiece. Domu won several prestigious awards, including the Science Fiction Grand Prix for the Story of the Year, which prior to Domu had only been awarded to prose. Domu is where Katsuhiro Otomo's voice as a manga artist crystallizes. It's the manga where his ability and his vision finally match, and it is one of my absolute favorite comics of all time. To anyone listening that is thinking of reading Akira but can't be bothered to read such a long manga, read Domu. What Akira does in 2,000 pages, Domu does it just as well in less than 250. And of course I am biased because I prefer anything that can be read in one sitting over long serialized content. But as William Shakespeare once wrote, brevity is the source of wit, and I agree with that. Having said that, the brevity of Katsuhiro Otomo is a special kind of brevity. His need to be concise in his storytelling goes hand in hand with his fascination with film and cinematic visual storytelling. Otomo conveys action in comics like nobody else had before. There are no shortcuts or tricks, only precise successions of static images that show the before and after in clear ways. Just like a camera, Otomo records action frame by frame, so his need to be concise in the moments he chooses to tell the story is absolutely necessary, given that his comics record every move, every change in a character's face, and every movement in a cinematic way. Just look at this scene where showing Tetsuo using his powers to walk over a dude takes 2 pages. But because he takes so much time, we as readers perceive the action to be moving faster and more fluidly. Just like in his animation for Akira, where he did 24 frames per second. In his comics, he makes as many panels as necessary to make the action fluid and natural. In Fireball, Domu, and Akira, he displays his cinematic storytelling ability in masterful ways. And in my opinion, Otomo represents the master and best exponent of cinematic comics. If we had a spectrum, where on the one hand we have cinematic and on the other literary comics, I would probably place Chris Ward on one end and Katsuhiro Otomo on the other, showing 2 masters of storytelling that understand the medium in 2 completely different ways. Where Otomo takes 4 pages to show a high-speed motorcycle crash, Ward takes 1 page to show the story of 3 generations. Step number 6. Don't try. After the success of Domu, Katsuhiro Otomo reached the point of mastery and maturity where only great things can happen. After being approached by young magazine editors to take another crack at the sci-fi title, Otomo decided to do a short 10-episode retelling of one of his childhood favorites, Tetsujin 28 Go. He didn't have great ambitions for the series. He just jotted down a plot in a notebook to present it to the editor, and the whole plot summary, which basically mirrors that of Tetsujin 28 Go, took a total of 2 small notebook pages. Initially, he only wanted to tell a 10-chapter story, simple story infused with all the popular culture references that he loved, like for example Canada's Bike, which is an homage to the light bikes in Tron. Akira is in short Katsuhiro Otomo doing what he's best at, what he loves, and having some fun. At this point, in 1982, 11 years after he started his professional career as a mangaka, and probably more than 20 years since he started copying from his favorite mangas, his storytelling and drawing abilities had reached the point where he could just have fun with it, and he didn't have to try as hard to get the basics right. At this point, it was basically second nature to him. He didn't even have to try. American writer Charles Bukowski summarizes this idea much better than I ever could when he said that
too many writers write for the wrong reasons. When everything works best, it's not because you chose writing, but because writing chose you. It's when you're mad with it. It's when it's stuffed in your ears, your nostrils, under your fingernails. It's when there's no hope but that.
I doubt that Otomo would have said it exactly this way because he's not as intense as that. He's far more casual in the way he speaks. But when reading Akira, you get the sense that this looks easy. Then this is, in my opinion, the biggest telltale that you are in the presence of a true master. People that master their craft make things that are extremely hard look easy. Akira was made one small panel at a time, one issue at a time. As he went along, Otomo simply crossed out sections he had just finished from his 2-page outline, and what initially was going to be little more than 200 pages became a 2,000-page epic sci-fi story that more than 30 years after his debut still feels contemporary. After he completed the story in 1990, 21 years after he began working as a professional mangaka, Katsuhiro Otomo basically quit manga and became more interested in cinema and animation. His debut as a director was the adaptation of the first 2 volumes of Akira, released in 1988. If you've seen the film Akira and you are confused by the ending, that's because that's only 2 volumes out of 6. When production started, Otomo was still working on the manga, so the story wasn't complete. After the enormous worldwide success of the animated feature of Akira, he continued collaborating with great filmmakers and animators such as Satoshi Kon. And although he has continued releasing some mangas, he has focused mostly on filmmaking. It's been 20 years since Otomo finished Akira and moved on to making films. So who knows, maybe he's about to drop something huge. And that's it. Those are the 6 steps to creating a popular culture classic that propels you to worldwide fame. Thank you to Mike Sykes, Mike Emmerich, Gasbot, and my boyfriend Stu for recording the extracts. And thanks to Jim Rock and Cartoonist Kifei for letting me use their clip from the video. Go check it out. It's a really good analysis of Akira and all the work of Katsuhiro Otomo. And also thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.